Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We have a highly custom deep dive lined up for you today. If you are joining us to get a better grip on how the Bible is actually put together, you are in the right place.
Absolutely.
Our mission today is to analyze a highly specific rhetorical device found in the English Bible. And we are relying on a stack of incredibly detailed theological notes and, well, linguistic texts.
The device we are looking at is called Hypophora.
Right. And now, if you are hearing that word and thinking it sounds like some obscure grammar term from a high school English class you slept through, stick with us. As we unpack this, you will see it is anything but dry.
It is intensely practical for how you read the text.
Yes, very practical. Hypophora is the practice of a writer raising a specific question and then immediately supplying the authoritative answer. What stands out in the sources we are looking at today is how they frame this entire concept.
They argue that in the hands of the biblical authors, this is not just a stylistic trick to make the writing sound clever.
No, not at all. They call it a divine hammer. It is a tool used by the Holy Spirit to crush human pride, to expose our faulty logic, and force a complete submission to divine truth.
That concept of the divine hammer sets the stage so well for what we're going to look at. To understand how this works mechanically and spiritually, we really need to view it through a specific confessional lens.
Which is key for this show.
Right. For our analysis today, we are adhering to the framework of the Westminster Confession. When you read the biblical text with that kind of theological precision, you start to see that Hypophora does incredibly heavy lifting.
It really does.
It acts as a robust defense of sovereign grace. It exposes total depravity by putting the absolute rebellion of the human heart on full display right there on the page.
Yeah.
And it highlights justification by faith alone, by anticipating the very objections a fallen mind will naturally raise against the gospel. We are going to look closely at how the biblical authors raise the very questions the devil whispers in our ears, only to strike those questions down with absolute, non-negotiable truth.
I love how you phrase that, raising the whispers of the devil and striking them down. Let us start by defining what Hypophora actually is, and maybe more crucially, what it is not.
That is a good starting point.
The notes we have are careful to contrast it with our normal, everyday assumptions about how we read the Bible or, how we interact with text in general. First, we need to contrast it with standard rhetorical questions.
The scholars sometimes use the Greek term erotema for this.
Right, erotema. Think about the Psalms for a second. When the psalmist cries out in Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" That is a standard rhetorical question. It gives voice to human anguish.
It is very raw.
It invites you, the reader, to step into that emotion, to ponder the weight of the suffering, and it leaves the conclusion somewhat open as an invitation to your own prayer life. Hypophora does not do that at all, does it?
No, it absolutely does not. And that distinction is crucial for you to grasp. A standard rhetorical question assumes the answer is either obvious or it is an expression of raw emotion that does not necessarily demand a neat, tidy resolution right that second. Hypophora is a completely different creature. It does not invite you to supply an answer. It does not invite you to ponder the mysteries of the universe.
No pondering allowed.
None. The author stands in the doorway and directs the traffic. You are not allowed to guess the conclusion. The text grabs you by the collar and says, here is the question you were thinking, and here is the definitive answer you must accept.
So it is highly controlling.
Highly controlling, yes. What is fascinating here is how that control functions in contrast to other types of dialogue. We also need to distinguish Hypophora from ordinary narrative dialogue.
Like what we see in the Gospels.
Right. If you read the Gospels, you see Jesus answering a crowd or debating with the Pharisees. That is a genuine interpersonal exchange happening in real-time history. One party asks a question out loud, the other party answers it out loud.
So you have actual different people speaking.
Yes, you have multiple autonomous voices interacting.
Yeah.
But in Hypophora, a single voice orchestrates both sides of the exchange. The author controls the objection, formats it as a question, and then provides the answer.
I want to pause there because I think that is a huge point. In the Gospels, the Pharisees are actually talking. In the epistles, Paul is doing all the talking, but he is playing both parts.
He is.
He is playing the part of the skeptic and the part of the apostle.
Spot on. And that brings up another technical term we need to separate it from, which is procatalepsis.
Procatalepsis.
Procatalepsis is the general, broad strategy of anticipating an objection. You might be giving a presentation at work and say, now, I know some of you are thinking the budget will not allow for this new project, but let me show you how we can fund it. You are anticipating the pushback.
Right. It is like when a politician is in a debate and says, my opponent is going to tell you my tax plan costs too much, but here are the numbers. They are trying to steal the opponent's thunder before the opponent even gets a chance to speak.
That is a great analogy. That general strategy of stealing their thunder is procatalepsis. Hypophora is the specific question-and-answer structural form that strategy takes.
It is the vehicle.
It is the grammatical vehicle. The author literally voices the objection as a direct question and then answers it immediately. It is not just, you might object. It is, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin? By no means. The structure is tight, rigid, and inescapable.
The analogy I saw in the reading for this is so helpful for visualizing it. They call it a warning label or a guardrail.
The guardrail image is brilliant.
Think about driving on a steep, winding mountain pass. The guardrail is there for one reason. It is there to keep you from plummeting off the edge of the cliff into a ravine. When the biblical author uses hypophora, the question is voiced solely to trap the reader in their own faulty logic.
It corners them.
It brings the objection into the light, refuses to let that objection rule the passage, and then anchors you safely in God's appointed answer. It forces a submission to divine authority. But spotting this device depends heavily on the tools used to read the text.
That is very true.
I hear you calling it a guardrail, but doesn't putting the heresy or the faulty logic right there on the page risk confusing the reader? What if they just read the bad question, assume it is what the Bible teaches, and skip the answer?
That is a legitimate danger, and it transitions us perfectly into the mechanics of English translation. If we look at the bigger picture of how Bibles are produced, we see how formatting, paragraphing, and punctuation choices either illuminate this device or completely obscure it.
Let us get into that.
The mechanics of translation dictate how we perceive the rhetorical temperature of the text. Let us look at punctuation and paragraphing first. A question mark followed by a decisive reply creates a tight, unified concept. They belong together.
They are a single unit of thought.
Yes. But publishers often make formatting decisions based on page layout, visual appeal, or inserting cross-references, not necessarily on the logical flow of the argument.
So you are saying a publisher might accidentally break the guardrail?
Yes. Think about modern study Bibles. They are wonderful tools, but they frequently insert bold section headings to help you find your place. If a publisher places a paragraph break or a bold section heading right between the hypothetical question and the apostolic answer, the modern reader might absorb the question as an independent, standalone truth.
Wow, so the visual break changes the meaning.
It can. They might read the objection, see a giant bold heading that says the new life, and then read the answer as a completely disconnected thought. They might quote the objection as if it were the doctrine, simply because a typographical choice separated it from its divine correction.
That is terrifying when you think about it. You could have a Christian quoting an ancient heresy thinking it is scripture because there was a line break on the page.
It happens more often than you would think.
And that brings up another issue the text highlights, which is quotation marks. In the original Greek manuscripts, they didn't have quotation marks, right? It was just a giant block of capital letters with no spaces.
That is correct. Ancient Greek manuscripts used a style called scriptio continua. No spaces between words, no punctuation, no lowercase letters.
So when we read Paul's letters, and he is anticipating all these objections from his opponents in Corinth or Rome, the English translators have to play detective.
They do.
They have to determine where the hypothetical opponent's objection begins and where it ends.
And that determination is critical for the theology of the church. If the translators misplace the quotation marks, they might make the opponent's heresy sound like the apostles' actual doctrine.
Which would be a disaster.
A complete disaster. You could have a situation where a reader thinks Paul is teaching a false concept, when in reality, he is quoting a false concept in order to destroy it. A classic example is in 1 Corinthians.
Oh, chapter 6, right.
Yes, Paul quotes the Corinthians' own slogans back to them. They were running around saying, all things are lawful for me. Paul quotes that and then provides the hypophoric correction. But not all things are helpful.
So the slogan is the objection.
Yes. If a translator fails to put all things are lawful for me in quotation marks, it looks like Paul is advocating for total moral anarchy.
Wow. So the quotation marks are actually theological guardrails themselves. And then there is the issue of how the answers to these questions are actually translated, specifically the negations.
The negations are fascinating.
The notes spend a lot of time on this rare Greek phrase, me genoito. Older English translations, like the King James Version, rendered this with the thunderous phrase, God forbid.
The contrast between the older translations and the newer ones is striking, and it affects how you hear the author's voice in your head. God forbid carries a liturgical, almost terrifying weight.
It really does.
It signals that a massive moral boundary has been crossed. It tells the reader that the question they just asked isn't just incorrect, it is blasphemous. Modern translations, however, often use a crisper, more logical rendering like by no means, or even a calm, certainly not.
It changes the whole vibe. God forbid sounds like a prophet slamming his fist on a pulpit. Certainly not. Sounds like a college professor mildly correcting a math error on a chalkboard.
That is a great comparison. And while the underlying Greek words are identical, choosing what we call formal equivalence, which tries to translate word for word and capture the gravity of the idiom, versus dynamic equivalence, which tries to capture the modern thought-for-thought meaning, changes the rhetorical temperature.
So it changes how we perceive the apostle's tone.
Yes. Is the apostle calmly clarifying a point of doctrine, or is he expressing a holy abhorrence of a false premise? The context usually demands the latter. Paul is horrified by the questions he is raising.
Beyond just the translation choices of specific words, the notes go deep into the very grammar of the original languages, arguing that the grammar itself supports this absolute authority structure.
Yes, the structural level.
They talk about a Greek syntax tree. Now, for someone who hasn't taken seminary-level Greek, how does drawing a syntax tree prove that God is crushing human autonomy?
Think of a syntax tree like a blueprint for a house. It shows you the load-bearing walls and the decorative additions. In Greek grammar, you have independent clauses, which are the main ideas that can stand on their own, and subordinate clauses, which depend entirely on the main idea for their meaning.
Okay, I am with you.
When you map out these passages of Hypophora, the human hypothetical question is always, grammatically speaking, entirely subordinated to the divine answer.
Meaning the human question is never the load-bearing wall.
Correct. The human question is a decorative addition designed to highlight the strength of the main structure. The divine answer occupies the main independent clause.
So the theology is built into the grammar.
The grammar itself refutes human autonomy.
Yeah.
You cannot parse the Greek sentence without making the human objection bow the knee to the apostolic declaration. The structure of the language reflects the structure of reality. God speaks, and human reasoning must align itself underneath that speech.
That is fascinating. So the theology isn't just in the definitions of the words, it is baked into the very skeleton of the sentences. So we know how to spot this device on the printed page, we understand the translation mechanics behind it, and we see how the grammar forces submission.
Where to go next?
Let us shift gears and look at how it functions in the earliest parts of the biblical narrative. If this is such an effective weapon, where do we first see it deployed? The sources take us right into the Hebrew scriptures, specifically looking at the prophets and wisdom literature.
Yes, the Old Covenant context.
In the Old Covenant, Hypophora has distinct forensic, meaning judicial, and catechetical, meaning instructional, functions. Let us start with the prophets and this concept of forensic disputation. The notes focus heavily on the book of Malachi.
Malachi is a textbook example.
God uses what the scholars call a rib pattern. What is a rib pattern, and how does it relate to Hypophora?
A rib pattern, spelled R-I-B in English transliteration, is a Hebrew term for a covenant lawsuit. In the ancient Near East, if a vassal nation rebelled against a sovereign king, the king would issue a formal legal document prosecuting them for breaking the treaty.
So it is a very formal, recognized structure in that culture.
Absolutely. The prophets borrow this legal framework. God is acting as the prosecuting attorney, the judge, and the jury against the nation of Israel for breaking the covenant made at Sinai.
So it is a literal courtroom scene happening in the text.
Yes, and Malachi is the perfect example. The historical context is vital here. The Israelites have returned from exile in Babylon. The temple has been rebuilt, but things are not glorious.
They are struggling.
The crops are failing, the economy is stagnant, and the people have grown incredibly cynical. They are bored with God. They are bringing sick, blind animals to the altar because they don't think God is worth their best livestock. In the opening chapter of Malachi, God issues the opening statement of the lawsuit. I have loved you.
And the people immediately push back. They arrogantly reply, how have you loved us?
That exchange in Malachi is chilling when you understand the psychology behind it. You have to recognize that the people's question is not innocent curiosity. A child asks, why is the sky blue? Out of wonder.
Yeah.
Israel is asking, how have you loved us? As a defensive denial, masking spiritual apathy. They are challenging the very character of God. They're
Yeah.
looking at their difficult circumstances and concluding that God is a liar.
And because it is hypophora, God doesn't let them sit in that accusation. He doesn't let the jury deliberate on their question. He immediately answers with the evidence of distinguishing grace, pointing to Jacob and Esau.
He brings it right back to election.
She says, "Is not Esau Jacob's brother? Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I hated."
This raises an essential point about how the text operates theologically. This acts as the first use of the law. In Reformed theology, the first use of the law is to act as a mirror, exposing our sin and stripping away our self-righteousness.
It shows us who we really are.
Exactly. God is prosecuting covenant unfaithfulness. He brings their internal, cynical whispers, the things they're grumbling about in their tents, out into the open to issue a public indictment. He exposes their entitlement.
They thought they were owed a blessing.
They thought they deserved good crops and a booming economy. God reminds them that they are descendants of a deceiver named Jacob, and the only reason they aren't destroyed like Edom is because of his sovereign, unmerited election.
It is exactly like a courtroom cross-examination.
Huh.
I am picturing a trial where the defendant is acting smug on the stand, claiming they are completely innocent, and then the prosecuting attorney pulls out the defendant's deleted text messages and reads them into the public record.
That is a great modern equivalent.
The judge pulls the criminal's internal thoughts into light to issue a guilty verdict. You cannot hide behind your cynical questions when the judge already knows your motives and has the receipts.
That is a very accurate way to visualize it. The hypophora traps them. But we also need to recognize that it is not all judicial and combative. There is also a catechetical clarity found in the wisdom literature. Let us look at how it functions in the Psalms, specifically Psalms 15 and 24.
Right, the tone shifts completely here. The psalmist asks, "Who shall dwell in your holy hill?" Or, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord?" And the immediate answer describes the righteous person.
The one with clean hands and a pure heart.
The one who does not lift up his soul to what is false.
The function there is vastly different from Malachi, but equally vital for the life of the believer. The prophets use it to indict, the wisdom writers use it to instruct. This is a catechetical use. A catechism is simply a summary of religious doctrine in the form of questions and answers meant to be memorized.
Like the Westminster Shorter Catechism, what is the chief end of man?
Spot on. When the psalmist asks, "Who may ascend the hill of the Lord?" it is not a debate. This is not about earning salvation through good works. The question and answer define holiness in concrete terms.
It sets the standard.
It directs the conscience toward honest self-examination and preparation for corporate worship.
So it is acting as a pedagogical doorway. You ask the question, who may approach a holy God? And the text gives you the definitive standard, ensuring you do not treat worship as a casual, flippant ceremony.
It demands integrity. In the Old Covenant, the temple was the localized presence of God on earth. You could not just stroll into the courts with unconfessed sin and a heart full of malice toward your neighbor.
You had to be prepared.
The Hypophora in Psalm 15 lists the ethical requirements of living in covenant with God. It forces the worshiper to pause at the gate, ask the question, hear the standard, and realize their desperate need for the sacrificial system happening inside that temple. It brings the abstract concept of holiness down to the ground level of clean hands and a pure heart.
That transition from the Old Testament into the New Testament is where this gets incredibly dense. If this was God's strategy for prosecuting Israel in an ancient courtroom or preparing them for temple worship, how does that translate when we get to the early church?
It adapts to a new reality.
They weren't a nation state anymore. They didn't have a physical temple. They were a scattered flock dealing with a totally different set of philosophical and theological heresies.
That is where we see the Apostle Paul pick up this device and use it with devastating precision. We are moving into the realm of apostolic guardrails and confessional adherence.
This is where the theology gets really rich.
Paul uses hypophora in his epistles for tight polemical control. He is a shepherd fighting off wolves, and he uses this grammatical structure as his primary weapon. The notes highlight that he is specifically guarding the early church against three major perennial errors: legalism, antinomianism, and Arminianism.
Let us start with antinomianism. For those who aren't familiar with the term, antinomianism basically means against the law. It is the idea that since we are saved by grace, the moral law no longer matters. We can live however we want.
A very common distortion.
Paul tackles this head-on in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. He writes, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? By no means."
Paul is anticipating the fleshly, fallen distortion of the gospel. He has just spent 5 chapters arguing meticulously that justification is by faith alone, apart from the works of the law. He argues that where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. Now, the fallen human mind hears that and immediately runs to a wicked conclusion.
Right. The fallen mind thinks, wait a minute, if God gets glory by forgiving my sin, and his grace is bigger than my sin, then the best way to give God glory is to sin as much as possible. Let us give him plenty of material to work with.
That is the exact antinomian inference. It turns the grace of God into a license for immorality. Paul voices that exact thought. He pulls the secret objection out of the shadows and formats it as a question. Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? And then he drops the hammer. By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it?
Is that me, genoito again? God forbid.
Yes, and if we tie this directly to the Westminster Confession, we see a perfect alignment between Paul's grammar and Reformed systematic theology. The Confession meticulously separates justification, which is covered in chapter 11, from sanctification, which is covered in chapter 13.
That separation is vital.
Justification is a one-time legal declaration where God pardons our sins and counts us righteous solely because of Christ's imputed righteousness.
It is outside of us. We contribute nothing.
Correct. But the Confession, following Paul, insists that this justification must logically and inevitably result in sanctification, which is the ongoing internal work of God's Spirit renewing our nature.
Because we cannot stay the same.
Why? Because of our union with Christ. You
Right.
cannot have the legal benefits of Christ's death without the transformative reality of his resurrection life. You died to sin, how can you live in it? The Hypophora in Romans 6 protects the doctrine of justification from being mutated into a license to sin. It builds an impenetrable wall between grace and lawlessness.
That makes a lot of sense. He is protecting the gospel from those who want to abuse it, but then Paul turns around and uses the exact same grammatical tool to protect the gospel from those who want to reject God's sovereignty entirely.
Yes, Romans 9.
Let us look at Romans 9, verse 14. This is arguably the most controversial chapter in the entire Bible for a modern reader. Paul is explaining the doctrine of unconditional election, the reality that God chooses whom he will save based entirely on his own sovereign will, not on anything foreseen in the creature. He uses the example of Jacob and Esau again, just like Malachi.
Returning to that same well.
Before they were born, before they had done anything good or bad, God loved Jacob and hated Esau.
And Paul knows precisely how a human being is going to react to that statement.
Yes, the human mind hears that, and the immediate visceral reaction is to cry out, that is unfair. If God chooses before we are even born, how can he blame us? Paul voices that specific objection. He writes, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? And then he answers his own question. By no means.
This specific text is brilliant because it reorders authority entirely. The creature is forbidden from placing the Creator on moral trial. The objection assumes that human beings have an independent standard of justice, and we are holding God up to our standard to see if he passes the test. Paul's Hypophora shatters that illusion.
He goes on to quote Exodus, saying, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. Basically saying, God's definition of justice is whatever God decides to do.
That is right. God's revealed character sets the standard by which all human concepts of fairness must be judged. If your concept of fairness dictates that God owes every single rebel an equal chance at salvation, your concept of fairness is corrupt and unbiblical.
That is a hard pill for modern people to swallow.
It is. This connects seamlessly to the Westminster Confession's teaching on God's eternal decree in chapter 3 and providence in chapter 5. The Confession states that God, from all eternity, did freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass.
Including the eternal destinies of men and angels.
Yes. And he does this not based on any foresight of faith or good works, but according to the secret counsel and good pleasure of his will. God is not beholden to human standards or democratic voting.
He is God.
The Hypophora in Romans 9 forces the reader to recognize that questioning God's justice is not a mark of deep philosophical insight. It is a manifestation of intellectual pride and creaturely rebellion. It shuts the mouth of the objector.
He literally says, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? He compares us to a lump of clay arguing with the potter. It is incredibly humbling. But Paul also uses it to expose skepticism, not just theological rebellion. Let us look at 1 Corinthians 15, verses 35 through 38.
The resurrection passage.
The context here is the resurrection of the dead. Some people in the Corinthian church were denying that believers would be bodily resurrected.
The Greek culture despised the physical body. They thought the highest goal of salvation was to escape the physical realm and exist as pure floating spirits. So the idea of a physical bodily resurrection was repulsive to them.
So Paul anticipates their skeptical pushback. He writes, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come?" He is voicing the skepticism of his audience, and his answer doesn't start with a gentle pastoral explanation. It starts with a severe rebuke.
Very strong review.
He says, "You foolish person," and then he follows that with the seed analogy, explaining that what you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and God gives it a body as he has chosen.
This is a masterclass in reading the room. Paul exposes their skepticism, which is posing as intellectual inquiry. The Corinthians were framing their objection as a scientific or biological question. How does the molecular structure of a corpse reassemble itself? They were using a how question as a mask for sheer disbelief.
They weren't looking for an answer, they were looking for an excuse to dismiss the doctrine.
Absolutely. By calling them foolish, Paul cuts through the intellectual facade. He points to nature, the sowing of a seed, to show that God brings life out of death all the time. The Hypophora prevents the Corinthian church from getting bogged down in endless, useless philosophical speculation. A text without this systematic grammatical fence is easily pillaged by wolves. Think about how vulnerable the early church was to these errors. They didn't have 2,000 years of church history to lean on.
They didn't have the Westminster Confession yet.
They had the apostolic letters. Hypophora protects the flock from twisting the indicative, which is what Christ has already done in history, to avoid the imperative, which is what believers must do in response. It locks the doctrine into place so that human reasoning cannot carve out an escape route. The grammar functions as a shepherd's staff, beating off the wolves of heresy.
And that takes us directly from these ancient apostolic defenses into the struggles of the modern church. The notes we are analyzing highlight that studying this rhetorical device is not an academic exercise for grammar nerds. The pastoral application of Hypophora is meant to confront the modern mind.
It has to land in the pew.
It aims to change the head, the heart, and the hands of the person sitting in the pew on a Sunday morning. Let us be honest about the culture we live in. The modern era thrives on pluralism. It loves subjective truth. You have your truth, I have my truth.
We see that everywhere.
We see so much seeker-sensitive pragmatism in modern churches that prioritizes the felt need of the congregation over objective, hard realities. But Hypophora shatters that entirely, doesn't it? It demonstrates that the triune God does not negotiate his decrees in a committee meeting.
It is entirely countercultural to the modern mindset. We live in an age of the open-ended dialogue. We elevate the asking of questions over the finding of answers. We celebrate deconstruction. But Hypophora demands reconstruction.
Reconstruction based on truth.
The sequence of how this works pastorally is crucial for anyone teaching or reading the Bible today. Hypophora acts as the law first. It exposes the idols of the heart and corners the conscience. When Paul asks, "Are we to continue in sin?" and then slams the door with "by no means," he stops the modern hearer from defining their own moral truth. He brings the objective weight of God's holiness crashing down on our subjective preferences.
It clears the ground.
It clears the ground, yes.
Ah.
It strips us of our autonomy. Then, and only then, immediately after that wounding work of the law, it acts as the gospel. It points the wounded soul, now bereft of any arguments or excuses, to the person and work of Jesus Christ. The text clears the ground of human merit so the grace of God can be clearly seen as the only viable rescue.
The notes point out that the high point of all this biblical rhetoric is soli Deo gloria, the glory of God alone and the exaltation of Christ. If we want to follow the historical models, the Puritans, the early reformers like Calvin and Luther, and later men like Charles Spurgeon, our preaching and our personal reading must use clear, urgent, hope-filled language.
We cannot obscure it.
It cannot rely on technical jargon to obscure the sharp edges of the text. We cannot soften the Hypophora to make it more palatable to a modern audience.
Contrast the biblical question and answer structure with what we often hear in the modern prosperity movement or various social justice movements within the church.
Right, let us look at that contrast.
Those modern frameworks often trade the offense of the cross for a political manifesto or a hollow promise of earthly wealth. They intentionally avoid doctrinal friction. They want the listener to feel comfortable.
They leave the questions open-ended so everyone can fill in the blank with whatever makes them happy.
Precisely. But biblical hypophora calls for a direct, pastoral confrontation with sin and error. It brings the hard, uncomfortable questions into the light, the questions about justice, about sin, about our apathy, and answers them with the terrifying law and the sweet gospel. It leaves no room for neutrality.
And according to the notes, this leads directly to a better appreciation for the visible word found in the sacraments. How does grammar connect to baptism and the Lord's Supper?
Think about what the sacraments are. They are tangible, physical answers to our internal spiritual doubts. When a believer struggles with the hypophora of Romans 6 when they ask, "Have I really died to sin?" the pastoral response is to point them to their baptism.
The visible sign.
The water is the visible seal of that reality. When they struggle with the guilt of their sin and wonder if grace is sufficient, the Lord's Supper provides the tangible bread and wine, declaring, "Christ's body was broken for you." The definitive answers provided in the text of Scripture are made visible and experiential in the sacraments. It drives the believer to realize that every single human doubt has been answered definitively in the person and work of Christ.
So let us recap the main takeaways from these incredible notes. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We have learned that hypophora is far more than a literary flourish or an accident of translation.
It is a governing principle.
It is a divine mechanism designed to silence the wisdom of the flesh. It governs doctrine, ensuring that the truth of the gospel is not twisted by our fallen, excuse-making logic. Whether it is God prosecuting the apathy of Israel and the prophets, or Paul defending the mechanics of justification in his letters to Rome and Corinth, this device drives the believer to abandon their own arguments and rest entirely in the unassailable, declared proclamation of the gospel.
As we conclude our analysis today, consider a highly specific application for your own life, particularly in the quiet moments of your private prayer life. When internal doubts, anxieties, or sinful rationalizations begin to whisper in your mind, when you find yourself asking the cynical questions of Malachi or the antinomian questions of Romans 6, you can utilize the pattern of biblical hypophora yourself.
How does that work practically?
You can bring that specific objection out of the shadows and into light of prayer. Do not let it sit in the back of your mind as a vague anxiety. State it clearly. Say to God, "Lord, I am doubting your goodness right now," or "Lord, I'm trying to justify this specific sin." Articulate the faulty premise.
Put it into words.
And then immediately answer it out loud with a definitive truth from Scripture. Say, "By no means," quote, "a promise." Remind yourself of the objective reality of the gospel. Refuse to let your own fallen logic have the last word in your prayer closet. Subject your anxious and rebellious thoughts to the divine hammer of the Word.
That is a brilliant and incredibly practical way to end this. We are learning to talk back to ourselves using the grammar of the Bible. Thank you for joining us for this custom deep dive on Reformed thinking. We hope this look into the mechanics of Scripture gives you a greater confidence in the text. We wish you joyful obedience and peace as you rest in the sovereign grace of God.